So this is going to be a fireside chat, although we don't have a fireside burning in this room. Maybe we can get started, Pak Tom, in terms of, and welcome to the Indonesian Investment Forum.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always fun, always a lot of fun, big honor to be able to address your audience. So looking forward to it.
Thank you. I think maybe we can just get started by an issue that is at the top of the mind of almost everybody around the world. The United States has just had a kind of maybe a political earthquake in terms of the election of Donald Trump as the president-elect. We were chatting earlier today about the impact of the Trump presidency on Asia and more around the world. Maybe if you can share with us your views on how do you see the changing of the guard in America and its impact on the rest of us.
Right. So this is always a difficult answer to get across. It's not very sensationalist or headline friendly, but I guess the first question is, will the impact of President Trump on Southeast Asia be positive or negative, right? And I think the accurate answer would be, of course, the impact will be both, right? Both positive and negative. Which one outweighs which is, of course, the major question. But personally, I expect a lot of positive impact, and I also expect some, negative impact. I think the positive impact will come from fiscal stimulus. I think if you see the stock markets rallying sharply and the bond markets collapsing, they're effectively reflecting the expectation that President Trump, combined with a Republican-controlled Congress, will launch a major deficit spending, a major fiscal stimulus, which will be good for the U.S. economy, and what's good for the U.S. economy, will be good for East Asia, because we export a lot, to the U.S. of course. So a strong U.S. economy will suck in more imports from East Asia, including Southeast Asia. The negative potentially is, if he follows up on some of his campaign promises, which arguably he has to, right, to some extent at least, most likely there will be less free movement of people. There will be less free movement of capital. There will be less free movement of goods potentially and services. On the whole, I remain optimistic, I have to say.
Right. And in terms of Indonesia's own economic outlook over in the coming year and maybe a little bit beyond, how do you see Indonesia performing?
So that's a much easier answer. That's a much easier answer. Definitely, in my view, very, very positive, right? And if I can, you were kind enough to refer to the fact that we've been having this dialogue for 2 or 3 years already, right? If you remember, for much of those last 2 or 3 years, I've been very pessimistic.
Yes.
Actually, I've been very cautious, very paranoid, very pessimistic, especially 2013, going into the 2014 election here. And my advice to President Jokowi is always very cautious, very paranoid, quite pessimistic. But Shoaib, I think the turning point was 4th quarter of last year, which is when I finally turned optimistic. And that was despite being right after the shock devaluation of the Chinese currency, RMB, if you remember.
And we talked about that last year.
That's right, everybody freaked out, right? But to me, the key, there's a couple of key indicators. Indonesia, I think the key indicator was that GDP growth finally ticked up. So after 3 years in a row of slowdown, finally in the final quarter of 2015 actually ticked up, right? We only realized that in the 1st quarter of this year, when they published the numbers for the last quarter of last year. But that's when it turns out the economy rebounded, and of course it softened again a bit, rebounding again. But to me, number one, that's a strong sign of stabilization, right? And when you're trying to arrest a downturn, the first thing is you stabilize, right? Then gradually form a new basis from which you gradually raise your economic growth rates. You don't just sort of like do a V-shaped rebound. You know, that doesn't really happen with large economies in that sense. I think other key statistic is, you know, unemployment in the US is half what it was during the Lehman Brothers financial crisis in 2008, you know. After the financial crisis 2008, US unemployment peaked at something like above 10%. Today it's below 5%. You know, you sort of have to have faith. Like, labor markets that are that tight, after a while will lead to wage gains. And we're finally seeing fairly robust wage gains in salary compensation in the US, and even more promisingly, those strong wage gains are happening in the working class, right? So the less educated, like people who did not attend university, so high school graduates, workers, you know, working class, middle class, and even lower middle class, they're seeing the strongest income gains, right? And it's interesting, talk about innovation and robotics and artificial intelligence and job losses, right? You know, even before this wave, if you remember 7 or 8 years ago, there was a wave of outsourcing, offshoring to India, now to Philippines. People were freaking out, right, because jobs like call center or customer service were being lost in the USA and being moved to India, Philippines, other places. And even then we said, well, you can't outsource a haircut to India, right? You can't outsource your gardening
to India.
You know, to India. You can't outsource your snow shoveling to India. Well, now in this wave with artificial intelligence, with robotics, well, you still can't you know, outsource a haircut to a robot. You know, you still can't outsource a lot of things. You know, I don't think you can outsource nursing to a robot, right? So ironically, it's those personal touch jobs, those jobs that still require person-to-person
interaction,
that are actually gaining a premium. And you know, I think that's also gives a hint to where Indonesia might position itself during this wave of industrial innovation and disruption.
Right. So, will we see a higher 5% plus growth next year?
Well, we're already slightly above 5%. I think Finance Minister Sri Mulyani has put quite a prudent target, I would say, 5.1% growth. I think for the first time in several years, I would argue that we have the opportunity to surprise to the upside, right, to beat our target. I think for the last 2 years, we've always set a target and we've always fallen short. I think next year, I predict will be the first time that we put a conservative target, and we might actually have a good chance of exceeding the target, which I think, again, once that happens, will be very positive for sentiment.
Right. And in terms of, you know, challenges on the horizon, where do you see the outmarkers, you know, in terms of, you know, where you say we've got to watch this, you know, carefully?
I think you touched on it, Shoaib. I love it when you use the phrase political innovation.
Yes.
Right? So I think figures as diverse as Donald Trump, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and President Jokowi really are political innovators, right? Having said that, I think the time bomb or the risk at this point probably is in politics, right? Obviously, we see that domestically here in Indonesia, where the political situation has really heated up, and continues to be quite heated. But I think politics is kind of the main challenge, but I would argue potentially also the biggest opportunity today, right? So as President Jokowi likes to say, challenge equals opportunity, right? if there's no problems to solve, then how are you going to earn your keep?
Right.
How are you going to make money? Or if there's no inefficiency to fix, how are you going to make money?
Right.
So I think the challenges, the difficulties we face in politics around the world and domestically are potentially the biggest opportunity for innovation,
Right.
for troubleshooting and for problem solving.
Right. And when we were chatting earlier, we talked a little bit about the factors that led to the Trump victory, and one of the things that we talked about was how people feel ignored in today's
Yes.
highly globalized world, but especially by the elite, and where I think where the elite have lost touch. And you mentioned people just flying from Davos to Brussels to wherever and not really understanding what's happening on the ground. When you reflect back on Indonesia, is there a danger? And, President Jokowi, of course, is a very hands-on, very much on-the-ground type president. But do you feel that that sentiment of being ignored, of kind of being disfranchised by what's happening globally, is that percolating in Indonesia too?
So Shoaib, maybe the biggest fundamental change that we're witnessing today is the rise of populism, right? And again, I think a lot of us still have not fully grasped the magnitude of this, and perhaps very dangerously, technocrat and elite like me are the furthest behind in admitting that we may have started the era of populism, right? We're terrified of it. We refuse to admit that it's happening. We think that we can continue to win the argument by arguing, and by saying, look, I'm the smartest guy in the room. I'm the most educated. I'm the most knowledgeable. Just trust me, right? I think that era is breaking down. And now is the era of bottom-up rather than top-down, right? So it is the era of populism, and the longer we deny, the longer we're in denial about the reality, I think the more dangerous it is for the technocrats and the elites. I think, look, populism doesn't have to be all bad, right? I would argue that President Jokowi and Canada Prime Minister Justin Trudeau are every bit as populist as Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or what have you. So there's different ways to be populist. But I do think that we should have seen it coming with the huge increase in income inequality, with staggering fortunes being created at the same time when 70, 80% of us suffer stagnation. I think
that 1% phenomenon.
And look, it's funny. Technocrats like me, right? We like to argue based on numbers.
Right.
I mean, look at the GDP growth. Look at the per capita income. Look at these numbers, right? But we are not hearing the people screaming at us saying, we're feeling worse and worse. So it doesn't matter that the numbers are looking better and better, but we, the people, we're feeling worse and worse, right? And ironically, we may be better off with a situation where the numbers get worse, but people feel better, right? Because people's feelings matter. Perception is reality.
Right.
And, I think we, the leadership, the elites, we have to admit and acknowledge that reality will be shaped by the, by the bottom 80%.
Right.
It can no longer be shaped by the top 1%.
Right.